Welcome back to our final part of chapter 12. So today we are going to be finishing our discussion about motivated behaviors and how emotion plays into that, as well as this idea of how our brain rewards us and how we control some of our behaviors. And we're going to look today at a specific behavior, specifically food. And as we do that, we're going to be able to talk about a different set of behaviors that are called regulatory behaviors versus a set of behaviors called non-regulatory behaviors. And we'll learn sort of the difference between the two. So again, today we're going to discuss eating behaviors. But before we do that, and again, excuse my pun here, but I have some food for thought for you. So what I want you to think about a little bit is the following questions. Why do you eat? And then what do you eat? When do you eat? And then what controls what you eat? All right. And then again, now I want you to take it out of it being personal and think sort of from a psychological perspective. These are some things that psychologists might study. Why do some people eat too much, consume too many calories for what they need? And why do some people eat too little, meaning they don't consume enough calories, to the point where we have different criteria in the DSM for what we call eating disorders. Right? So think about these things, and we're going to discuss these a little bit, but again, the angle that we're going to look at it from is these are regulatory behaviors that we do where we have to regulate our own behavior, regulate when we will or will not do a behavior. All right? And that's why we're going to use food as an example, or eating as an example. So let's do a tiny bit of review. Again, this was done in the last couple of videos. If you want more detail on this, go back to those last couple of videos. But we've been talking a lot about the limbic system, and we said that within the limbic system, again, the limbic system, the hypothalamus is actually part of it. But the reason that I snuck the hypothalamus out here on its own is because we also talked in the last unit, in unit 2, about how the hypothalamus is coordinating with the pituitary gland, that's the endocrine system, for all the hormonal changes that are needed within the body. And food and eating behaviors requires a lot of different hormonal changes. So you have hormonal changes when you haven't been eating to keep your blood sugar at a certain level. You have hormonal changes that occur when you do eat, again, to keep your blood sugar at a normal level. You have other hormones that are released at different times and different things. So again, you need that hypothalamus and pituitary gland constantly sending each other messages to make sure that you're keeping yourself in homeostatic balance. But again, we also know that the hypothalamus is part of that limbic system, which is also, again, processing emotional things, processing memory as well, with the hippocampus in there. And then we talked about a lot in the last section about how the frontal lobe is responsible for some of those choices that you want to make, for your behavioral choices, for deciding when you want to do something. And so it's all of these structures sort of together that are helping us to decide and to then make motivated behavioral choices. And again, the goal here, as far as food is concerned, is to keep ourselves in homeostasis. So all of these work together for what we call a homeostatic mechanism. This is just a process that maintains critical body functions within a very narrow, fixed range. So let me give you some actual definitions here. A regulatory behavior is any behavior that is motivated. It's usually sort of an unconscious motivation, although you'll feel like, ooh, I want to do this, because it's meeting some kind of survival need. In other words, if you don't pay attention to the signals that you're getting or that your brain is making you kind of experience, you're not going to survive very well. All right. These are things like, what is your internal body temperature? In some cases, you don't get to even consciously control the behavior. Your body will hopefully just start sweating if you get too hot, or your body will hopefully just start shivering if you get too cold. All right. But eating and drinking behaviors, hopefully, if you do not have enough nutrient in your body, or if you do not have enough liquid in your body, you will be motivated. You'll feel hungry. You'll feel thirsty. And then hopefully you'll actually go and do something about it. You will go search for food. You'll go search for liquid until you can actually find it, and then hopefully you'll consume it. So again, these are the more homeostatic mechanisms, and again, you need to maintain these particular homeostatic mechanisms in order to survive. But again, that's not the only thing that our body is doing. Those are not the only behaviors that we do. As we also know, right, there are other times where we do behaviors that aren't necessary for our survival, and they aren't controlled by homeostatic mechanisms. And most of these involve the frontal lobes more than the actual hypothalamus itself. So again, you're still choosing to do them, but it's not really being driven by a need. You're not really getting some kind of signal that something is out of balance. Because mostly what's happening here is that you're getting some kind of external stimuli. You see something out in the world and it motivates you to want to go and do something. Remember last time I was talking about if you smell food, right, it's a lot more powerful. It's like, ooh, I want some of that like now. All right, some other things, parental behavior, aggression, right? If you see somebody acting aggressively, you're a lot more likely to want to be aggressive back. Curiosity, reading. And then what's also interesting here is that food preferences here. So notice what I got going on here. All right, food, at least parts of the elements of eating, are in both categories, both regulatory and non-regulatory. And that's one of the reasons why I chose to put food as the example here. All right, so regulatory behaviors maintain vital body system balance or homeostasis. Non-regulatory behaviors aren't controlled in that way. They are just things that you do anyway just because you want to or because you choose to. But again, eating is unique because it actually can be both. At some point, you need to eat because you need calories, you need the nutrients, you need the vitamins and the minerals and all the stuff that you bring in from eating. You need the liquid or you'll get dehydrated. But other times we eat and we aren't necessarily needing something. Our body doesn't need nutrient, it doesn't need vitamins, it doesn't need liquid, and yet we're still consuming things anyway. So that's why food can actually fit into both of these categories. Or depending on the foods that we choose to eat, right, it can either be regulatory or non-regulatory. Like I really should eat some vegetables, that's regulatory, but I would much rather eat this chocolate, that's non-regulatory. So really quickly, I want to review digestion. You got a bit of this in that very, very first lecture. But again, the goal of digestion is just to break down the food and absorb the nutrient that's in it. So to take out any vitamins and minerals that are in it, to take out any proteins and things that are in it, to then break them into the smallest building blocks, put them into the bloodstream, send them around to your body so that your body can then use those basic building blocks to build whatever it is that your body needs to build for itself. So again, you need to bring in those nutrients, and you also need to eat to obtain energy. And there are 3 kinds of nutrients that can be extracted that can give us energy. Probably the best form of energy because it's the most dense and it's got the biggest amount of energy reserve would be lipids or fats. But again, can't always take that in. So sometimes we can take in amino acids, which are the building blocks of proteins. And then sometimes we just take in the raw form of energy, which is glucose or sugar. Because ultimately fats would be broken down into sugars before they would then be used. And if you remember from previous exams, glucose is the only real form of energy that your neurons can use. So if there's a limited supply of sugar in your body is going to save any and all available sugar to be sent to the brain and start using other stored kinds of energy like fats for the rest of the body because it's got to send that glucose up to the brain. Again, as a reminder here, you have the digestive system, the various different organs that are part of the digestive system, as well as its cooperation with the endocrine system because it works with a lot of the different glands that secrete various enzymes and things that help break down the food as it goes through the digestive system. So you have mechanical breaking down of the food because these organs actually squish the food up, as well as chemical breaking down of the food thanks to all of the endocrine system that's dumping in the various things there. So don't forget to go and review that. And what we also know is that when you're getting ready to eat or when you're getting ready to consume food, it happens in 3 phases. And we call these the 3 phases of energy metabolism. And energy metabolism are just chemical changes that your body will make to make energy available for use. Okay, so this is specifically related to humans and eating. And the three phases are called the cephalic phase, the absorptive phase, and the fasting phase. And I think you actually heard these as well in the first unit in one of the crash course videos. If not, there is a good crash course video on digestion and you can go look it up. But I'm just going to quickly go over these. So the cephalic phase occurs when you're preparing to eat. So either when you know that you're getting ready to eat, or again, when you're basically when you think you're gonna eat. Like if you smell something and you're like, ooh, that smells good, your body can actually be triggered to go into a cephalic phase because you're like, ooh, maybe I can go eat some of that. The next phase is called the absorptive phase, and this is when you're actively eating. Like right now I'm currently eating, so energy is being absorbed into my body because I'm eating it and I'm digesting it. And then the third phase is called the fasting phase, and this happens when you are not eating anymore and you're not preparing to eat. And so your body is withdrawing energy from the reserves because, again, you don't have anything actively being digested into your body. So think about like overnight, for example. This is why we call it breakfast, because you're breaking the fast that you have been doing overnight by not eating, right? So you're stopping having to use your energy reserves overnight because you have now entered a new cephalic phase, hopefully in the morning when you hopefully eat breakfast. Again, sort of in picture form with a little more details, I like this picture here. The cephalic phase, again, is a preparatory phase. And again, it can be triggered either by knowing that you're going to get some food or by just smelling or seeing food. So again, you don't even have to actually see it. You can just expect that there will be food. Like if I know I'm getting ready to go to breakfast, or if I know I'm getting ready to go to lunch, right, I can get ready for it. Or if I smell or see food, that will trigger a cephalic phase. And what happens at that point is your body starts pumping out some insulin to get ready because it thinks you're getting ready to put food in your body. It will stop producing glucagon, which is a second enzyme that would have started to break down fat to put more sugar back into the bloodstream. And then again, assuming you do act on the cephalic phase and start eating, that moves you into the absorptive phase, and that's when you're actually taking in food and you're digesting the food. And again, insulin stays high so that the blood sugar doesn't go too high, and any excess things that you take in are converted into fat. And again, all of this is over here. And again, glucagon stays low. So now you've finished your absorptive phase, you've stopped eating, you're finished with whatever meal you have. All right, everything has now been digested, and so now you're going to go into a fasting phase, however long that lasts. Again, for most people, our longest fasting phase is from whenever we've eaten our last meal or last snack in the evening to when we eat again the next day. Hopefully it's the next morning. All right, that's our longest fasting phase. And what's happening during the fasting phase is that, again, because we're not actively taking in energy, nor are we preparing to take in energy, we have these two levels of these two hormones reversed. So you've got glucagon levels that are really high so that it can convert fat as needed into fatty acids, and then the fatty acids can be used as a source of energy. And then you've also got insulin levels pretty low, right, so that your any and all available glucose isn't being bound up by the insulin and can be sent to the brain. So again, you've got these three phases of energy metabolism here. Now, you can be triggered into a cephalic phase and then not actually allow yourself to eat and go back into a fasting phase. That is a thing that can happen. But as you may know, that isn't necessarily comfortable to have happen either, right? If you've ever smelled really good food but then not had a chance to go and eat, that can actually almost be physically painful, if not at least psychologically painful. All right, so we know that the body needs to know how well things are going. So the digestive system is an autonomic function. It's happening thanks to the autonomic system. You don't actually have to squeeze your intestines around to make them start contracting those muscles, but your body still needs to kind of be given information about how well it's going. And there are a lot of feedback mechanisms that are happening in there. So when food reaches the intestines, it interacts with a bunch of different receptors that are there that trigger the release of at least 10 different kinds of hormones. And I am not, at least in this class, going to make you remember those 10 different kinds of hormones, right? Because that's just way too much. But one example that I'm going to talk about really quick is called, I'm just going to call it CCK, because we always call it. And it plays a role in satiety. And satiety just means that you feel full. So when you feel full, CCK has come on board. And that's going to come into play here when we talk about some of the theories that we have for why people start and stop eating when they do. So one of the theories is called the set point theory. And the idea here is it's almost kind of like a thermostat, right? Like you set your thermostat to, like in the summer at our house, we set ours during the day to 75 degrees. So if the house gets hotter than 75 degrees, the air conditioning will come on. When it comes back down to 75 degrees, the air conditioning will go off. And if it gets hotter again, it will come on. That's kind of like what this set point theory is, right? So basically what it says is that you've got so much of an energy reserve, and as the energy reserve starts to go down, you're going to start to feel hungry. And eventually, once it reaches a set point, you're going to be triggered to eat. And then you'll eat and your energy supply will go back up and you'll be good to go for a little while. But eventually it'll start to come back down again. You'll feel hungry. Eventually you'll be triggered to eat and your energy supply will go back up. So the set point theory says that hunger itself is the motivation to eat. So hunger is kind of like the trigger. So hunger is kind of like the 75 degrees in my house. So that if you reach that 75 degrees, or if you reach the point of being hungry, it's going to trigger you to go and eat. All right, so hunger is that set point that we have. And what we know, for example, is that glucose levels can determine when we eat. Right? So glucose could be one of the things that's helping us to feel hungry, for example. We feel hungry when our glucose levels drop. And we can demonstrate this artificially in the lab. We can bring people in and give them some medications that will purposefully decrease their level of glucose. And people will say, yeah, I feel hungry. I want to eat right now. Right? Does that make sense? This is the first theory of why we are motivated to eat. But this theory isn't without criticism. There are a few things that just don't make sense. The first thing is, though, is that reductions in glucose don't reliably induce eating, right? Which means that just because your blood glucose goes down doesn't mean you're definitely gonna eat. Another thing is, though, is that even though you're full, so even though you've just eaten a full meal, so let me go back here. I've just eaten a full meal and my energy reserves have gone all the way back up, right? If somebody offers me a chocolate pie, I'm still going to go, well, you know what? I could probably eat a little bit of that. In other words, that little phrase, there's always room for dessert. Or when I was a little kid, we used to always joke in my family that we had a separate stomach for dessert, right? I don't know if you ever had that joke in your family, right? This set point theory doesn't make sense for that, right? If we're full and if our energy reserve is back up, I shouldn't want dessert according to this theory because I don't need that extra energy anymore, right? So this says to me that the set point theory can't explain everything about why we eat. It can explain maybe some of the reasons why we eat, but not everything. So there is probably something to our body's amount of energy. There's probably something to our amount of blood sugar. There's probably something to the amount of glucose. That's what I mean by blood sugar. That does trigger us to feel hungry. That does trigger us to eat. But again, the fact that people can eat other things like dessert, especially when they're already full, doesn't fit well with the theory. And the fact that we have so many kinds of eating disorders, and again, not just eating too much, which would be considered obesity, but people that also do not eat enough, which would be anorexia, or people that eat and then purge, meaning they do eat a whole bunch and either throw it back up or use some sort of laxative or excessive exercise to get rid of it. That just doesn't make sense. It doesn't fit with the set point theory, because if they get rid of the food, that means they also got rid of the energy supply, which means they should be hungry and then motivated to go and eat again. So again, it just doesn't, this theory just can't explain some of the things that we see. So another thing that we know, another theory that possibly can explain it, and it's probably one of those that it's a little bit of all of these theories, is called the positive incentive theory. And this one says that we are drawn to eat because we just like eating. In other words, we've evolved to crave food, especially food that tastes good to us, food that smells good to us, food that makes us feel good. And unfortunately, those kinds of foods are usually the foods that aren't the super healthiest kinds of foods. I mean, they are in small doses, but they're things like really fatty foods, really sugary foods, really salty foods, which are fine in small amounts, but most people aren't going to crave broccoli. Most people aren't going to crave spinach, right? We are drawn, right, to eat things that aren't necessarily the most nutritious of foods. But again, what happens here is that we see something that we know we like, right? And it's like, yeah, I want to eat that. And that's probably why the dessert thing works, right? Because desserts are usually very, very highly motivating because it's something we really like. It's usually really sweet and sugary or chocolatey or whatever it is that most people like in their desserts. And again, there's probably multiple factors that go into it here. And this is not the whole story, but this is going to make a lot more sense, especially in the very last lecture of this unit when we start talking about addiction, why some of these things make a little bit more sense because some of the same mechanisms are going to be involved. All right, so some of those original questions I asked you. What do you eat? When do you eat? And how much do you eat? Well, it kind of depends, right? Here are a few things that determine what you eat. First of all, it depends on your preferences. Do you prefer sweet and fatty foods? If so, they're full of really lots of energy. Do you prefer salty foods that's got a lot of sodium stuff in it? I'll tell you a story about sushi in just a minute. But what we have found is that our ancient ancestors, it made sense, right, that they would eat as much sweet and salty stuff and as much fatty stuff as they could whenever they found it. Because it wasn't always that often when you could find high energy, high calorie foods just lying around, right? It wasn't like it was today where you could just go into a grocery store and get it at the drop of a hat, right? You really had to take advantage of the times when you found sweet, fatty foods with high energy or salty foods that had a lot of sodium in it. So it makes sense that our ancient ancestors would have evolved to crave it so that when they did see it, they would eat a whole bunch of it and continue to eat a whole bunch of it and wouldn't necessarily get tired of it. Now today, flash forward, because we haven't evolved to not still have that mechanism, we do still have that mechanism in place. Our problem now is well, what do we do when we're completely surrounded by this 100% of the time? Well, then we have to learn different ways to control ourselves and sort of override this adaptation that we have. Another adaptation that we have that we already talked about would be aversions. Again, things that are associated with toxins. Again, if you've ever gotten sick after eating a food, you'll probably never eat it again. But a lot of people say they don't like to eat bitter foods. There are some people that say they don't like to drink coffee because it tastes bitter. Again, I'm not one of those. It's also probably because I'm a non-taster versus a super taster. But again, coffee just tastes delicious to me. But again, I get the argument because, again, bitter is usually associated with toxins, and it would make sense that people that wouldn't eat things that tasted bitter probably wouldn't have encountered toxins and probably would have lived a much healthier and safer life. So the other thing that we also know is that we eat stuff because we've just learned to eat stuff. We've learned to eat stuff because of social influences, and that's where these two pictures come in here, right? We know that, and again, from rat studies, that rats will prefer a diet of vitamins and foods that they smelled in their mother's milk or on other rats' breath versus foods that they've never seen before. So again, we like what is familiar. So if you think about your favorite foods, it's probably stuff that you ate growing up. It's probably stuff that you were served growing up because that's familiar to you. You learned what you prefer. You also learned things that you don't prefer. Right? And some of that is because of social influences. So here are my two stories. The first one is about beer. I used to hate the taste of beer. I thought it was really gross. But all of my friends drank it in college, probably because it was cheap. And again, I know this is a terrible story to tell you because it's all about bad peer pressure. But nonetheless, I started drinking it as well. And over time, I just kind of learned to like it. Again, probably because I associated it with the fun of hanging out with friends. But now I'm okay with it and I can drink it. Still not my favorite. I'd much rather have something else. But again, I'll drink it. So again, I learned to have a preference because of social influences. And then the other example is sushi. I grew up thinking that I hated sushi. As it turns out, no, I don't hate sushi at all. My mom hates sushi. And so she never served it to us, and she would always go, ugh, every time you mention it. In fact, even today, like if she were here right now and I would go, hey, Mom, do you want sushi? She would go, ugh, right? It turns out, no, it's just her. I love sushi, right? So after the first time I actually got myself to try it, I was like, hold the phone, this is delicious, right? So again, I had learned an aversion that I actually didn't even have just because of social influences. So I was able to unlearn that aversion very quickly and go, hold the phone, no, I do love sushi. So again, Some things that determine what we eat is usually determined by, again, what we were served, what we're used to, what we're, what we're given, as well as some things from our ancient ancestors. Some things that determine when we eat, we get hungry when it's usually our set meal times. If you eat regularly throughout the day, you will find that your body will remind you. If you're used to eating at noon every single day, your body will remind you when it gets close to noon. It's almost really funny how your body has this internal clock to it, which it absolutely does, and your body's food preferences will get synced with your internal clock, and it'll go, oh, excuse me, it's noon here, let me know. So as mealtime approaches, your body will enter itself into a cephalic phase, even if you weren't thinking about food, and even if you didn't see food, and even if you didn't smell food, because your body got itself into a rhythmic pattern. And I have a really cool story about this. When I was in graduate school, we ran these experiments with our mice. So our mice were drinking alcohol, and we would measure how much alcohol they would drink. And so what we would do is we would give them 2 different bottles. One of them had alcohol in it, one of them had just regular water in it. And again, what we were seeing was, would they drink the alcohol versus the regular water? And the answer is yes, they absolutely would. But again, we had to still give them the choice. And so what we would do is we would only give them a certain amount of time to go and drink the alcohol. We didn't just let them have a free-for-all all day long. We would just let them have a short period of time. So it would kind of be like a human going out to party or something, right? You can only go for a couple hours to party. So we would put the drinking bottles on at noon, and we would take them off at 1 o'clock. So they would get basically 1 hour to drink their alcohol. And then we would read the bottles to see how much alcohol they'd actually consumed. Then we had a lot of other stuff to do that afternoon. So our lunchtime really had to be between 12 and 1. So basically we would put the bottles on at 12 and we would eat around 12:15 or so. I mean, that was just kind of how it worked out throughout the day. And again, I did this 5 days a week, sometimes even 6 days a week, for 2 solid years, right, of running different experiments, but on the same timeline every single day. And it was so funny because on the weekends, even when I wasn't in the lab, I would get hungry at 12:15 every day. I mean, like clockwork. I could tell you what time of day it was because I was hungry, because I was so used to eating at that time. My body was like, okay, it's 12:15, we need to eat now, right? And it took months after being out of graduate school for me to be like, I don't have to eat at 12:15. I can eat at some other time, right? Like, it was because my body was just so ready and so trained to eat at that time. And the hardest part was when we would have to switch times. We would always have these big debates in the lab about whether or not we should just keep the mice on the same schedule and not actually change times, like when you fall back or spring forward or whatever. And oh my gosh, it was crazy. But again, things that influence when we eat. There are other things that influence how much we eat. First of all, what should influence how much you eat is if you feel full. So if you feel full, you should stop. That should be what happens. All right, and there are lots of different signals in our body, and I'm going to move my rat here just a minute. There's a lot of different signals in our body, both in your actual gut as well as from the glucose that gets into your blood, that should send signals to your brain that say you're full, you've had enough, you should stop now. But what we have learned through something called a sham eating study is that satiety signals don't always stop you from eating. And this is what a sham study is. Let me make my rat a little bigger here so you can see it. So what happens is they take the rat's esophagus, all right, and they dissect it, and so that if he eats, the food comes back out, right? And they take the rest of the esophagus and they tie it off so the stomach acid can't get out. All right, so the food doesn't actually get into the stomach. So technically, the food should never get into the stomach, so the stomach should never be able to send the signal to the rat's brain that he's full, right? And I know this sounds like a cruel experiment, and I agree with you, it is, but this was done before a lot of the different humane factors. But they were still making sure the rat was getting enough nutrient and stuff. They would give it through an IV. But go with me here. So what should happen is that, again, because the rat is not getting signals, right, the rat should keep eating and eating and eating and eating and eating and eating, because, again, the food isn't actually getting in here to first give it the nutrient that it needs, but also to stretch out the stomach and to get into the intestine to send the glucose level up and all that kind of stuff. But what we found is that initially, right after this procedure was done, is that the rats ate a normal sized meal, right? So basically what this says is that if we're used to eating a certain amount, right, that's probably what we're gonna eat. That we eat a certain amount because we're used to it, not because we're actually hungry. And this became a really big deal when it came to this idea of dieting, right? Is that, yeah, just because you can eat a whole plate of food doesn't mean you necessarily need to eat a whole plate of food. This idea of, well, I always eat a burger and fries when I go here. Well, yeah, okay, but did you actually need that much food, or could you have done something different? So some more things about how much we eat. There are several actual terms here that we learned from some different studies. Something that's called the appetizer effect. We know that small amounts of foods can increase hunger because it triggers a cephalic phase. So it's not enough to actually make you full, but it's just enough to have triggered a cephalic phase. So again, you do want to eat a small amount, but you want to eat just enough to actually make you feel full, and not enough to just trigger a cephalic phase but not actually make you feel full. The other thing is you want to watch your serving sizes. The larger the serving, the more you're going to probably eat. If you have a huge plate and you fill it with food, you'll probably eat a whole lot more than you have a small plate. And social influences. If you're eating with other people, you're more likely to eat up to 60% more. And I use this example of puppies here. And even rats will eat more in a group. So what people always ask me, invariably somebody will ask me every semester when I talk about this is, well, what should I do if I want to diet? Right? Well, the first piece of advice I always tell people is talk to your actual doctor and make sure that it's healthy for you given your set of biological circumstances. But in general, right, things that we know from psychology based on this is this: don't snack. Actually eat a full but small meal multiple times a day. So in other words, make sure you get enough food to get out of the cephalic phase and into the absorptive phase. So again, you don't want to eat so much that you feel stuffed, but you want to make sure you're eating enough to get out of the cephalic phase that you don't feel uncomfortable. Now, some people call those snacks as opposed to meals. Whatever you want to think of it as is fine. But the idea is that you're eating enough foods of a balanced nature. So you're not just eating one type of food. You're trying to eat some of several different kinds of foods, healthier foods. So things like fruits, vegetables, whole grains, things like that. And you want to eat a smaller portion that's enough to get you past the cephalic phase and into the absorptive phase. Another example is you don't want to order a large portion, or if you do, go ahead and ask for some kind of to-go box, or if you're already at home, go ahead and put some of it away immediately, right? If you're at home, purposefully eat on a smaller plate, because again, you'll be a lot more likely to eat less, right? It's almost like you can trick your brain into thinking you've had more when you haven't. Don't necessarily eat around friends, or if you do, actually pay attention to how much you're eating instead of just chit-chatting. Eating slowly can actually help you if you're going into a social situation, or drink more water instead of eating. So if you know you're bad about paying attention when you're actually out with friends, just drink a whole bunch of water. So, you know, if your mouth is wanting to be busy and doing something while you're hanging out and listening to your friends, just drinking water instead of actually eating, so that you won't be mindlessly eating and putting things in your mouth while you're listening. Again, just based on some of these things that we've learned here. So we mentioned earlier that there's always room for dessert. Well, why is that? Well, we know that there's another thing that happens called sensory specific satiety, and that's always hard for me to say because of all the S's that are in there. But we know that tasting a food immediately decreases the positive incentive value of similar tastes and decreases the palatability of all foods about 30 minutes later. In other words, if you're eating something salty, you don't really want any more salty stuff, but you'll eat something sweet. Or if you're eating something sweet, you don't really want any more sweet stuff, but you'll eat something salty right afterwards. Right? That's that sensory specific satiety thing. And then eventually you'll stop wanting all foods. And this is a good thing because it encourages a varied diet, right? If we just kept wanting the same thing over and over and over and over again, it wouldn't be so good for us because we wouldn't vary our diet very much. There are a few things that are resistant to this. Some of our starches, rice, bread, potatoes are kind of immune to this. Green salad is immune to this. And those are all probably good that they're immune to this, because those all pack a bunch of nutrients and a bunch of calories into it. But other things, again, like that are not so good for you, like potato chips and cake and all that kind of stuff, are going to be susceptible to this. So the last part of this lecture is going to talk a little more about some of the research on hunger and satiety, and I'm going to talk to you about two, first of all, a myth, and then the role of blood glucose levels. Because for a long time, and actually this is what I was taught in graduate school, and we now know that it's not true at all. I'm going to talk to you a little bit about sort of regulation of why we eat and stuff. So we do know that blood glucose is important for when we're hungry and when we're full. But blood glucose actually drops prior to preparing to eat. It's not actually the cue like we used to think. So if you go back to what we were talking about with this idea of the set point theory, we don't think it's glucose anymore. We don't think it's the drop in glucose exactly, because the glucose drops to get you ready to eat. That it's not, you don't feel the glucose drop. That the glucose drop then somehow must send a signal that then makes you want to eat. But that glucose dropping itself is not the signal. And we also know that glucose has to decrease by about 50% in order to trigger the feeding. So again, it just doesn't make a lot of sense that glucose is the only signal there for that set point theory. If you give glucose prior to a meal, it doesn't actually suppress eating, which it should, right? Because if glucose has gone down and that's what triggered you to be hungry, well, if I give you glucose, that should make you not hungry. That doesn't work. And we also know that reduced blood glucose can contribute to hunger, but changes in blood glucose don't prevent hunger. So it's like, well, that doesn't make sense, and that busts up that whole theory. And then the second thing, and again, I learned this in graduate school, and they have since learned that it's not true at all, is we used to say that there were parts of the hypothalamus that were specific for hunger and specific for being full or satiety. And again, I remember learning this to this day. We used to learn that the ventromedial hypothalamus was called the satiety center, meaning if you stimulated it, an animal would experience satiety, and the lateral hypothalamus was the hunger center. So basically how they had originally thought this was this. What they did is they took an animal and they would lesion the ventromedial hypothalamus. In other words, they would go in and they would just destroy the ventromedial hypothalamus. And what would happen afterwards is that these animals would just keep eating and keep eating and keep eating and keep eating and overeat, and they would just get enormously huge. And when I'm saying enormously huge, I'm not kidding. I mean, look, they get enormously huge compared to their counterparts, all right? And then they took other animals, and this is how they quote unquote found a hunger center, and they would lesion the lateral hypothalamus, and these animals just wouldn't eat at all. But what they have since found is that neither of these is really true. First of all, with the lateral hypothalamus, what we think is happening is that it's not that they're necessarily unwilling to eat, they just don't really do much of anything very well as far as motor output. They don't really swallow very well. In other words, they might still be hungry, they just aren't doing a good job in general. And again, with the ventromedial hypothalamus, as far as being the satiety center, it's not that they're not necessarily feeling full. We just think that it leads to weight gain in food intake, as you can see here. But here's what we really think is kind of happening. We think that ultimately the rats will kind of level off and they just sort of maintain a new almost like set point for weight. But we also know that as these experiments showed, they weren't just lesioning the VMH, ventromedial hypothalamus, they were actually destroying other brain regions along the way, such as the noradrenergic bundle and the paraventricular nucleus. And so it's more likely that a combination of all of these was actually causing trouble with the feeling of satiety, and that the lateral hypothalamus, as I already showed you, was not the feeding center at all, because these rats will be just fine if you can keep them alive using a feeding tube, and again, because they couldn't actually feed themselves anymore. It was too much of a motor disturbance. And so what we actually now kind of think is that the hypothalamus's job is to regulate energy metabolism, not eating specifically. So eating is just a behavior that's done to bring in energy, but that what the hypothalamus is paying attention to is not eating versus not eating. The hypothalamus is paying attention to how much energy do we have and how much energy do we need. And that's what the hypothalamus is paying attention to. So again, you've got your digestive system working with your hormonal system, sending signals to the hypothalamus that lead to eating. So again, when there's not enough energy, it will lead to eating behaviors. But that's also why so many other things can also lead to eating behaviors. That's why, again, seeing food that looks really good, or hey, even though I'm really full, that cake looks delicious, all of that and those thinking cognitive things can still lead to eating behaviors. The last part of this is a little bit of information, again, about people that don't control their feeding in a normal way, and either have too much body fat or not enough body fat. And again, there are a lot of reasons why this can happen besides just you're a bad person and you didn't eat enough or you ate too much. In fact, that's the absolute last reason why someone would be obese or anorexic. Usually there's a lot of other things that are going on. But what we have been able to see is that we should be concerned in both directions. We need to be concerned about people that are obese. There are a lot of other health complications, and we need to be concerned about individuals that are anorexic as well as bulimic, because they aren't taking in the proper amount of nutrient. Obesity is a huge issue. It's been getting worse and worse and worse and worse. This was from 1989. I'm going to kind of flip through here, and I'm going to show you how it's been getting worse. I don't have the most recent data, but just kind of watch and see how things have been progressively going throughout the years. Oh, we hit 2000. Most of you are being born now. You didn't stand a chance. All right, I only had 2010. All right, but as you can see, right, look at this. This is still 11 years ago, and look at what the rate was. In fact, since then, they started inventing new colors, right? So that all the graph wasn't basically all orange and red, because they didn't need the blue anymore, sadly. All right, so who needs to be concerned about obesity? Well, everybody does. All right, obesity is related to a ton of other health problems. There's actually an epidemic of obesity going on right now. Why? Because again, our ancient ancestors had evolved these preferences for high calorie foods and the ability to quickly store the fat and the energy that's in those foods very easily. There are also cultural practices and beliefs that promote consumption. I mean, for goodness sake, we advertise about all of this stuff here in the United States. But we also know that it's not just a medical problem, it's also a psychological problem, right? There's a lot of bullying associated with people's weight. There's a lot of shame and there's a lot of guilt associated with people's weight. There's a huge burden to the healthcare system. Healthcare in general is not good about even providing healthcare for people that are overweight. So there's a lot of problems for individuals that are obese, besides just the fact that they are obese. And this is definitely something that I think psychologists can take the lead on in the future and actually teach the medical community a thing or two and say, look, we need to address this head on. We don't just need to say, we don't like the way that you look. We need to say, first of all, that is ridiculous. Second of all, these individuals have a medical issue that needs to be addressed, or they're going to have a lot more medical issues that are going to be even worse later on. Third, there's a reason why these individuals are in the situation that they are in, because the healthy food is more expensive than the non-healthy food. Fourth, okay, there's absolutely no social support. Anyway, I'm not going to go down this rant, but there's so many things that are wrong with society as a whole, right? Like we tend to look at just one piece at a time, but that's why psychologists can be super important, because we can look at all the pieces, all of the political pieces and the societal pieces and the psychological pieces, and we can put them all together and say, okay, this is what we need to do about it. But I'm going to stop ranting for now. All right, so why do some people become obese while others don't? Well, people have different energy inputs. So people eat different amounts of things. Some people have larger cephalic phases than others do. In other words, when they see or smell or think about food, it's a lot stronger for them than it is for other people. Some people have different energy output differences. Some people exercise and have more physical activity than others. And then for some people, none of these are different. They just have different genetics, which is unfortunately just flat out not fair, but that's where it is. And that's the part that we need to address is what do we do when it is just the genetics? What do we do when you are eating fairly healthy foods and when you are exercising a decent amount and you're still obese? What do we do then? And that's the part that we haven't done a very good job in society about addressing as well. Why are weight loss programs typically ineffective? Well, again, our bodies are programmed to store fat. So if you try to start losing weight, your body's going to freak out and go, hold up, my poor body here, they must be starving. They must be in a time of famine in their little group. I'm going to save my human. This is your body talking now. I'm going to save my human and make sure I save every available energy ounce for them as fat because I'm a good body and I'm going to save my human. And you're like, no, I'm trying to lose the fat. Don't save the fat. All right? Again, you're fighting your evolutionary programming at this point. We also know that long-term weight loss requires permanent lifestyle changes. And again, not only is that hard to do, as I was just trying not to rant about before, it can actually be really expensive, sometimes even too expensive. It's cheaper to be unhealthy in the short term. And some of us can't afford to live for the long term right now. And again, that's a whole rant that I'm really trying hard not to go down. I apologize. Also, exercise can make you hungry. So you're exercising to lose weight, but then that makes you even more hungry, and then that's harder. And so then you eat more calories, and it's just like a never-ending cycle. So this is why you actually need to work with doctors and medical professionals to try to lose weight effectively. But again, this isn't the only side of the equation that's bad. Eating too little is also a huge issue. Anorexia is defined as voluntary self-starvation or excessive exercise. Basically, you're not eating enough calories to stay alive. It can actually be fatal in 10% of the patients. It's very damaging to your organs, particularly your heart. Bulimia is similar, although these individuals may or may not necessarily look absolutely thin. These individuals will binge, eat a bunch of food, and typically purge that food in some way. They can be of a normal weight. These have similar symptoms to each other in that the person isn't getting the caloric input that they need. They're not getting the nutrient that their body needs, but sometimes they can be difficult to distinguish. And sometimes a person can actually fluctuate back and forth between the two different disorders. And they're associated with typically with distorted body image. A lot of times these can almost border on sort of an obsessive compulsive type disorder. There's usually a secondary depression or anxiety that's also going along with these things. And I'm not actually going to show it to you in the lecture, but I'm going to highly suggest that you go and watch the video that's underneath our lecture here. It's called Desperately Hungry Housewives, and it's a documentary that talks through several different women that have struggled with anorexia and bulimia. And I think it's a lot more impactful than just hearing me talk about it, to hear them actually share their story and how and why they struggled with these disorders. All right, hopefully that makes sense. I will talk to you guys soon. Let me know if you have questions.